Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Ty, and I work here at the Aquarium of the Pacific here in Long Beach, and I'm really excited to be with you this morning because we're going to talk about some really amazing animals that call this place home, called the tide pools. But before we go into any of that, I just want to let you know that I would love for you to join me along with our program today, because one of the fun things about doing these live broadcasts is that you can text in or email. And so what we would love for you to do if you want to join with us is you can use this number right here below, 562-286-1838, and you can text in any of your questions that you may have. You can share your observations, anything you would like to share. We would love to hear from you. Or if you're watching this afterwards, after this is broadcasted, or if it's just easier, you can also use the email below that, live@lbaop.org, and we'll be sure to get back to you with an answer to any of your questions. So, my friends, today what we are going to do is we are going to be scientists together. That's correct. You watching right now, you are going to be a scientist if you're here watching with me. Because being a scientist doesn't mean that you need to be in a lab coat in some fancy lab somewhere. No, not at all. Anyone can be a scientist anywhere, because all it means is that we're going to ask some questions. So we're going to be curious about some things. We're going to make some observations. That just means we're going to look, we're going to explore some different things together. We're going to talk with one another, or if you're watching with people, talk with them too. And then hopefully by the end, it means that we're going to learn a whole lot together. So, are you ready to dive in, scientists? What we'll do first is, let's just take a look behind me, because this place that we're starting at is the habitat that we're going to be looking at. Now, when we say habitat, maybe think about if you've heard that word before. Maybe think about what it means. An animal's habitat. Now, something that may come to mind, the way I like to think about it, is a habitat is just an animal's home. Now, on land, we have a whole bunch of different types of habitats. We might have the rainforest, the Arctic, where it's really cold and chilly. We might have the desert, where it can be really dry and sometimes really, really hot. So in those different habitats, you're going to see different animals, right? If I took a polar bear from the Arctic and I put it into the desert, do you think that polar bear is going to do very well? Probably not, because it has certain things on its body that are helpful for its matching habitat, the Arctic. Maybe you're thinking of its fur. It's colored white so it can blend in to the ice. And also, if it's really cold in the Arctic, that fur is going to help them keep warm. But if that polar bear is trying to hang out in the desert, it's probably going to be really, really hot. It's going to be very easy to see. It's not going to have the food it needs, right? And so you can see that there's a little bit of a mismatch there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to think about the animals that live in this habitat, the tide pool, and think about the things that they have on their bodies that help them to survive in the tide pools. So if you make some initial observations here behind me, this is actually one of our exhibits here at the aquarium that represents a tide pool. Now, see what things you notice. I noticed right away that there's definitely lots of animals. You can see that throughout this entire thing, there's almost no room where there's not an animal. Some of them may be familiar to you already. Maybe a sea star. We also have sea anemones. Or if you look closely down here, you even see a sea urchin. And there's even more too. Oh, even back behind me on this side, you can see that there's a sea cucumber. And we'll talk about some of the animals more in depth today. But you can see there's lots of animals that live here. You can see that they're packed really closely together too. That's something important about a tide pool. There's not a whole lot of space. So let's see if maybe we can zoom out now. We're close in. See if we can take a look at what a real tide pool looks like if you were to go explore one yourself. Now, that's also something that's really cool about the tide pool habitat is, as you can see here, actually, look over there. There's some people. But look, you can see that this is right where the beach, right where the land meets the ocean. And so that's really cool because you don't need a scuba tank to explore a tide pool. All you need is to know the time of your tides and the energy to explore. Because as the land meets the ocean here, you can see that there are lots of these rocks, these rocky parts that form this habitat. Because at first you might think, why do we care about rocks, right? But it's true. These are super important. That rock builds all that structure for these tide pools to form. And if you're willing, if you go and look through these pools, you're going to see lots and lots of stuff, and that's what we're going to check out today. But I said earlier that you need to know what time your tides are. What does that mean? Why does that even matter what time of the day it is? Well, because when we're thinking about tide pools, this habitat will actually change throughout the day a whole lot. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to try my very, very best to do a little bit of a drawing on a tide pool so we can think about how they work. So over here, this is where I'm going to have the land. These are all those rocks. The land is coming down to about here. Oops, let's do it like this. So these are some of those rocks that we saw along the beach. And then we'll have it come back down like this. Now, maybe you've heard before things such as high tide and low tide. Now, when it's high tide, that means the water is going to be, well, really high. And so sometimes through the day, if you find that it is high tide, the water may be all the way up here and it might completely cover these rocks. You may not be able to see them if you went down to the beach during high tide. So we'll mark that, high tide. Now, depending where you are in the world, your tides may look very different. Here in Southern California, where we are, we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides every single day. And the time will change every single day. But if it's high tide, water will cover the entire thing, and you won't even be able to see some of those rocks sometimes. But if we were to go ahead and let's do a different color. So I'll do green as my low tide water. So if it's low tide, that means the water is going to go down like this. And then your water might only be maybe about here. So this might be low tide. Now, as you can see, if our water is only up to here, now we would be able to see those rocks that, like you saw in the picture there. But since this water is going to be changing all the time, if our tide went from high tide to low tide, right, so it was up here, but then it goes down, these pools are going to form. Do you see that? So some of that water that was there from high tide can get left inside some of these little rocks as the water level goes down. Now, as the tides change, the habitat will look very different. So, as you can see here, maybe as the water is moving, because it's going to be constantly moving, because if you've ever been to the beach, maybe you've seen that there are waves often. They may be big or small, but the water is usually always moving. And so when you have this low tide and that water starts to go down, see all these different pools that are forming here? They can be pretty big like this one. They can be really tiny pools too. And in each of these little pools, you might find lots and lots of different critters. Now, imagine that you lived here. Imagine you were an animal in the tide pool. Can you think of any challenges that you might have to face living in the tide pools? Because I'll tell you right away, it's a pretty tough place to live. So think for a second, and if you're watching with somebody, maybe brainstorm some ideas. What might make it hard to live in tide pools? Let's see. Because, like I said, it can be a pretty challenging place. Well, one thing we already talked about is the water is always moving. And if the water is moving, you're also going to get big waves. Imagine living in a place where the waves will be crashing and splashing on you all day long. That can be pretty tough. And so, in order to deal with that challenge, animals might need to be able to either move or have a way to stick. Because if you don't want to get swept away in those waves, right? So we'll talk about some of the ways that some of these animals either move or some of the ways that they avoid being moved by finding ways to stick in place. And another thing that we're going to talk about is food. Because in this habitat, just like every habitat, everything needs to find a way to live, to eat. And so we're going to find ways, how do these animals eat? Now, there might be other challenges too, like it might be really sunny and hot in this place, and so they need to find ways to not dry out, right? Because imagine if you were an animal, if we go back to our drawing, that maybe lived, let's pick a different color. Okay. let's pretend that maybe we're a little sea anemone that lives right here. We'll talk about sea anemones in a second. If you're in high tide, you're covered with water. Easy peasy. That's nice. I can stay nice and cool. But if the water goes down, now I'm exposed. Now I'm out of the water. Now it might get a lot hotter, right? And so this is why it can be a pretty tough place to live. And so we'll explore some of the ways that these animals deal with these challenges. So I'm going to have my friend Soraya pull up a picture of some of these animals that coat the rocks. Some of the animals that stick completely in place. Oh yeah, so we can see here, now we can see that water change right before your eyes. So right now, do you think this is low tide or high tide? This is going to be low tide because as you can see, the water is way out there. You can see all the rocks. But as the water comes up, look at how this habitat completely changes. Nice. Okay, let's see some animals that live in this place and see how they deal with these challenges. Now, if you've tuned in with us before, we often talk about a lot of these animals, but I'm going to try and see if I can find some ways to introduce maybe some ones that might be new. All right, so take a close look here. Do you see any animals? Do you recognize any of these animals? Well, actually, just about every part of this picture is an animal. Now, sometimes the rocks in these tide pools might be completely covered in life to the point where you can't even see the rock itself because there are lots of animals like these mussels or barnacles that coat the rocks. They need that hard surface to stick to because their strategy is, well, why move if I don't have to? If I can find a way to stick in place and fight through those waves, then I can just wait for food to come to me too. So let's talk a little bit more about those mussels. So mussels, as you can see, are these ones here. They're sort of a bluish color in our picture here. But I'll show you on our dot cam some of their shells that they have. Now, shells can be really helpful for not only mussels, but a lot of different animals because it adds protection, right? Because they can be pretty tough. So if you can imagine waves crashing you all day, having a body that's sort of like a shield can be very helpful. For mussels, what they do is they actually have two shells that close together. Now, this one is broken, so it's going to be a little bit hard to see. But they'll have two shells that stick together. And then when the water goes down and the waves are away and they want to prevent themselves from drying out in the sun, all they need to do is close up. Now their body on the inside is protected, it's covered, it can stay nice and cool, and then they just wait for the water to come back. And when the water does come back and it's time for them to eat, well, if they don't have a way to move, all they have to do is open up, and as the water flows through them, they can filter feed. They can catch tiny little plankton and tiny little critters that are in the water. And so that's a really good way of being able to survive in the tide pool. Ooh, perfect. So look closely here. This is another one of our exhibits. But if you look, what's lining the walls of this exhibit? Now it looks like it might look like a rock from far away, but all this entire patch is those mussels and barnacles. Now, mussels, what they do in order to survive, in order to stick, is they make these little threads. So what I'll do is I'll show you a little drawing. I will try my best to do a drawing. But in these mussels, what they can do is they produce these little, they're called threads, byssal threads. So here's a shell of one. And so when you see their shape, right, they kind of pointed like this, kind of fan out like that. Now, if this was the rock that they're sticking onto, we'll draw a little rock. They have these really cool little threads. I'll draw them in blue. And these threads can go down and attach themselves to the rocks. Now, you may have seen, too, that they usually don't live alone. They're usually in these big groups. And if you have big groups of mussels all making these little threads, then they can attach to each other and the rock, and they can help each other to stick to those rocks. And those are called byssal threads. So that's one way that these really cool animals survive in the tide pools. So if they need to avoid the waves crashing on them, well, stick to a rock, stick to each other. Do they need to eat? Well, let's just wait until the water comes back and we'll open up our shell. And as the waves splash on down, we can catch all those little things that are living inside of there. Very nice. Now, these animals have a hard shell to keep them safe, but there are some other animals that stick in place that do not have that hard shell to protect them, but instead are very, very squishy and soft. There's actually some in this picture here and a close-up here. Do you recognize these animals? Maybe you've seen these before. These are called sea anemones. Now, sea anemones, as you can see in this video, as the current is moving, you can see their tentacles are sort of flowing through the water, but they're doing a very good job at also staying in place. Because at the bottom there, look really closely, they have a really sticky layer on the bottom of their body that attaches themselves to the rocks. Now, as they stick to that rock, instead of having a hard shell like a mussel, what they do is they just let their squishy body flow with the water. So as the waves move, they don't need to be worried about sticking in place because they just let their body move with the current. And so having a flexible body, a soft, squishy, flexible body can also provide that same help that it needs in order to survive those strong waves in a tide pool. Now, how do you think this animal is going to eat? Maybe make some observations about what other parts that you notice. So we know that it's going to be sticking to the rock over here. But what other parts of its body stick out to you? Now, perhaps you're noticing already that as we're looking at these different anemones, there's many different colors they come in too. They're really, really beautiful animals. Here's a green one, a giant green anemone here. And you can see, do you see these things all the way around this sort of circle shape? Those are the tentacles of an anemone. Now, what do you think they might use those for? I kind of already gave you a hint because we're thinking about how they eat, right? So those tentacles are how they're going to grab their food. So those tentacles can often be very sticky. And so as things flow by, they can use these tentacles to stick to their food and grab their food. So even though they're not moving at all, as the food flows by, those sticky tentacles can do the job for them. Now, as an anemone, it's grabbed its food, it's grabbed its little snack on its tentacles, but now it has to bring it into its mouth, which is that little, almost looks like a belly button, right here in the middle. So as this anemone grabs its food, it'll bring it in, and then it'll actually sort of change its shape a bit. It'll look a little bit different when it's closed up. See this thing back over here? This is also a sea anemone. But where are its tentacles? I don't see any flowy tentacles on this one. That's because they're all pulled in. So you can see there's a little hole there because that means the anemone has pulled itself in. And so this one might be eating a snack. But that ability to fold in too can also be helpful if you live in the tide pools, because if the water goes down, right, and now I'm exposed, I don't want to dry out. I want to keep myself nice and cool. And so what you often see in these tide pools, see all these green things here? These are all anemones too. But what they've done is they've folded in all those tentacles to try and keep themselves from drying out. So they look a little bit different as the tide goes down. Now, look very closely too, and you'll see another clever trick that these anemones do. Look at the color of these. You can see they're bright green, but do you see any other colors on their body now, on these ones? Look very, very closely. Do you see all those like specks of like white and gray and bluish colors? Those are all different pieces of shells. And so it's kind of neat what some of these anemones do. We talked about the mussel earlier, whose whole body is covered by those tough shells. Anemones are soft and squishy, but as different pieces of shells and things that are broken flow by, they can actually go, hey, I want that. I want some of those shell pieces to cover myself too. So even though they don't make the shell, they can stick some of these shell pieces to their body and build their own little layer of protection on their body. Isn't that a cool little trick? So they've sort of taken the spirit of some of these shells and decided, well, if I just add some to myself by sticking to me, I can get some of those same benefits too. So anemones have that really cool trick. They can fold in, they can hold on to shells, and when the water comes back, those tentacles can help catch all of their food. So we've now talked about two of these different animals. I want to talk about one that maybe, hopefully, might be a new animal to you too. This one is called an abalone. And so I'm going to have my friend Soraya pull up a picture of some abalone. Now, let's play a little game of I Spy. Where are the abalone in this picture? Can you find any? If you're watching with someone, see who can find them first. I'll give you a hint. There's more than one in this picture. But where? Where are the animals? Now, maybe at first, it kind of just looks like we're showing you a picture of a pile of rocks, right? With some seaweed maybe. But there's a whole bunch of abalone here. This is an abalone. This is an abalone. There's also one over here. And then there's one over there. So, what do you notice about these animals, these abalone? Now, if you at first thought that they were just rocks, don't worry. That's not your fault. That's sort of what they want to do. That shell that they have on their outside can get covered with things, and it often has a color that matches the rocky habitat that they live in. Because if you look like a rock, you can hide from things. And if you have a sturdy shell that sort of feels like a rock, well, that's a great way to protect yourself too. So in California, there are a few different kinds of abalone, but the way you can think about them is they're big snails. Now, a snail might be more familiar to you if you've seen some snails, because there are lots that live in the ocean. There's also snails that live on land too, right? Here's an example of another one that lives in the ocean called a cowrie. Now, they come in lots of different colors, lots of different shapes, but the way that you can tell what an abalone is by actually looking closely at that shell, because they sort of have a spiral shape that you can see really well on this one, but you'll also see some of these little holes. Let's see. I actually have some abalone shells to show you today. So as we go over to my camera, I'll actually show you some shells of some abalone. And so if you look, you can see that the thing that makes abalone shells really sort of well known is those bumps and holes that go down their body. Now, as an abalone grows, it can even patch up old ones, but there'll always be some open holes. And that's because they use these to help breathe as water passes through. That's where they get rid of waste. And so it's a multi-function hole through their shell. But the shell itself, really tough, really sturdy, and helps protect them. Now, you may have even seen abalone shells before, like at shops and things, because oftentimes the insides of them will be really, really shiny, really colorful. And so oftentimes you may have come across these too. Now, abalones, they live in kelp forests, but you'll often find them in the tide pool too, where it's really shallow. Some can get really huge, as you can see here, right? So they're definitely not a small snail once they grow up. They can get really, really gigantic. But what they do is, as they go around the tide pools, they have a little mouth on the bottom side that it's going to be pretty difficult to see because, as you can see, they're always going to have their shell towards the top. But that little mouth on the bottom is how they'll go around on the rocks in the tide pools, on rocky reefs, and they use that to eat pieces of algae or seaweed. Like in that picture we saw earlier, there was some kelp, some seaweed with them. That was their lunch because they use that little mouth to scrape and eat things like this. So kelp is one of their favorite things to eat, but they'll also just munch on all different types of algae that grow on these rocks. Now, the aquarium actually has a very special connection to these amazing little snails because, like I said, there are a couple different kinds in Southern California. One of them is called the white abalone. Now, what happened to these animals, to all the abalone, but especially the white abalone, is people found out that they were pretty tasty. And so they were hunted a lot. Now, even though they've been hunted for many, many years before, when we took too many of them, we started to see that their populations, the amount of abalone out there, was going down really far. Now, this got to the point that the white abalone actually became the very first invertebrate on the endangered species list. And so, the aquarium is now part of a really amazing network that's dedicated to trying to bring back these amazing little snails. Now, as you can see in this picture, this whole tray is where little baby abalone grow. And so one thing that we do at the aquarium is we've taken in some of these white abalone. We're going to raise up some of their babies. And then as we raise them up, they will actually go back out into the ocean, which is really awesome. Because if you bring back these abalone, you help to bring back some of the balance in these places. Now, look closely here. Do you see anything interesting about the shell of this little abalone? Now, it might be hard to see just how tiny this one is, but see, this is a human hand right there, so that would be like me holding it just like this. It's really tiny, but there's a little tiny number plate here because we keep track of all the abalone that we raise that are going to go back out into the ocean. This way we can monitor them after they're put back in. We can make sure that they're surviving or find new ways or find new places for them to be put back out into the ocean. Now, if you saw earlier, tried to hide it a bit, but earlier I actually showed you one of the shells that has one of those little number plates stuck to it here, right? And so the White Abalone Project is a great thing because, like I said, we're helping to bring back some of these animals that have been in trouble. Now, the abalone is just another animal that lives in the tide pools, but let's think back to how they deal with some of those challenges. We talked about food already, right? They have a little mouth on the bottom that they use to scrape. And we kind of talked about how their shell, having that tough shell to protect themselves, helps them to not only camouflage, but will protect them against some of those strong waves that you might find in the tide pool. All right, my friends, let's see. I think we might have time. Let's show one more animal really quick. I'll let my friend Soraya choose any tide pool animal that she likes. We'll talk about it really quick, and then we'll review what we learned today. So let's see what Soraya wants to pull up for us today, because there are many, many options. Ooh, very nice. I love it. Hopefully that these are some really cool new animals for all of you. What is this thing here? Ever seen something that looks like this before? This, my friends, is called a sea hare. And since we were talking about abalone, which are kind of like big snails, sea hares are basically big underwater slugs. Now, they are really cool. I think they're really cute. They have these cute little antennae towards the front. And they kind of live similarly to the abalone. They just kind of slide around on the bottom, on the rocks, on the rocky reefs, using their little mouth to find some food. And they have some of these sea hares, like one that lives here in California, can also ink, kind of like an octopus, which is really cool. And so they have some really interesting strategies to survive in the tide pool as well. So, my friends, let's review quickly some of the things that we talked about today. Now, we thought about what it means to live in a tide pool, right? And how, as the tide changes throughout the day, the animals live in a pretty tough place, because you might be out of water. You need to find food, and you need to make sure that you don't get swept away in these strong waves. And so we talked about mussels that stick to the rocks, stick to each other, and only open up when it's time to eat. We talked about the anemones who, instead of having a hard shell, have a squishy body that flows with the water, but they have a strong sticky foot on the bottom there to stay in place. And then we talked a little bit about abalone, these really amazing ocean snails that are part of a new project for us to help bring them back into the ocean so that hopefully we can see them thriving here in California once again. And then as a bonus, we showed you that adorable, hopefully you think they're adorable too, the adorable sea hare that you can see here. All right, my friends, well, I hope you had a great time exploring with us. I know I did. If you have any of those lingering questions that you still want to ask, please don't hesitate. We'll put that number up one more time, and you can either text us here or use the email down below, and we'll be sure to get back to you if you have any questions or if there's just anything that you want to share, any takeaways from today. So I want to thank you so much again for joining us here at the Aquarium of the Pacific at our Aquarium Online Academy. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.